Ken, welcome to the Building and Growing podcast. We're delighted to have you here today.
Super. Looking forward to it. Really looking forward to it.
Excellent. So Ken is the partner and co-founder of Progressive. And would you like to start off by telling us a bit about yourself and indeed Progressive as well?
Yeah, well, the journey for me started about 9 or so years ago. So my background's brand marketing. So I had your normal brand marketing career. I used to work at Anheuser-Busch InBev, AB InBev. I did a few brand director roles there. And 9 years ago, I came across the startup world, especially in Shoreditch in East London.
Yes.
And it was one of those moments in one's life where I thought, what have I been missing? I mean, I was so taken aback by the positivity, the vibrancy and the enthusiasm that startups had that I just felt quite old and staid in the corporate world. I thought, my goodness, what am I doing in my life? And I wanted to work with people with this mindset. And I also realised quite quickly that the technology they had and were making was absolutely relevant to what we were doing in the brand world.
Yes.
So I wanted to join the two together, and that's quite a difficult join with different sizes of company, different cultures, different expectations, and it made me realise, Lucas, that there's a gap in the market, and there was 8 years ago for someone to be in the middle. So for someone who's got that understanding of the corporate world, as I had, and also someone who's really keen to become part of the startup world and to join the two, so to be like a bridge between the two. So eight years ago, my goodness, that's gone really quickly. 8 years ago, I jumped the corporate ship, and initially on my own started to become that man in the middle, that person in the middle, and roll forward to where we are now. I now co-found a company called Progressive. We're an innovation consultancy, and the part of the business that I'm responsible for is as I just mentioned, I and our team actually work with large corporates, the people like the GSKs, the Procter & Gamble's, the Mercedes, the DFS of this world. They give us business challenges, and we go out into the startup world globally. We ascertain what the main trends are, what's happening, but most importantly, we come back to the client with an overview of what the technology situation is in that area.
Okay.
And we help the client there narrow down that list of what could be 30 or 40 companies down to 5, and then eventually down to helping them identify a partner to do some paid work with.
Yes.
So we go from a brief to a pilot.
Fantastic. That's a very clear process in terms of the corporates coming with their briefs to you. You go out, you look at, say, 30 different companies, reduce that list to 5 with a key focus on the technology before allowing the corporates to engage with the startups. I suppose you mentioned that you really act in the middle of the corporates and the startups.
Yes.
Are you able to perhaps elaborate on the pain points as to why these corporates aren't able to, say, achieve this by themselves?
To be frank, I think part of the problem is that corporates, and I know it from my own previous experience, are just very, very busy. The day job is getting bigger and bigger.
Yes.
So to actually be able to go into the startup world, to understand how it ticks and to be a trusted member within it takes time. And I think time is something that everyone's short of, especially if you're in the corporate world for a big, large company. So you haven't really got the time or the license to actually go out there and understand what's happening. However, coupled with that, there is a need and a desire, I believe, for corporates to find out and to understand what's happening. So they're kind of caught where they want to find out more, but haven't actually got the bandwidth or the resource or the time to do it. So that's, hopefully where we come in.
So on the Progressive side, what's the sort of balance between full-time workers or contract workers that engage with the different startups? What does that team look like, and how do you engage with the corporates?
Yeah, I mean, we have a small handful of people full-time, and then we have 10 to 15 freelancers that we draw upon when needed. For the work that I specifically look on, which is this taking the corporate brief and searching to see what's out there in the startup world, it's generally myself, potentially another member of the team, and a lady called Sue, who's a great researcher, who's a freelance we work with. And between us, that's where we start doing the search. So over the 8 years that I've been doing this, I've built up quite a substantial network globally of people who either know loads of startups or run global accelerators. So when I get a brief, I can go to them and say, look, this is what my client's looking for. Can you potentially introduce us to people that you think we should talk to?
Yes.
And at the same time, Sue will do some research. So between us, we come back with a hopefully a very big landscape of what's happening. And then what we do then, Lucas, which I think makes us different, is we actually then reach out to the startups and talk to them. So we don't go back to the client with just a list, because to a certain extent, anyone can Google and give a list of what startups are operating where and how they do it. We actually talk to the founders
Yes.
to really understand what they're doing now, whether they're relevant for the brief we're looking at, whether they're interested in the brief that we're looking at, but most importantly, just to understand the potential of each technology, because what you sometimes see on a website or what you read on a Google search may not be the true current situation for that startup.
Yes.
So the reason we do that is that when we do go back to the client with the overview,
Yes.
we can talk from experience about each company that we've spoken to and we think could be relevant. So we can say, this is what they do. The founder works in this area. Their background's here. This is where they're going to go over roadmap.
Yes.
So it gives a much more in-depth overview of said startup, rather than just say, here is a list of 30. That's it, job done.
Yes.
So we do a lot more in-depth research, as well as kind of searching and talking to people. We want to come back with as much information as we can to the client to help them, as you say, narrow that field down from 30, 40 to 5 to 1 or 2.
Okay, that's a really good process. So, you're starting out with network, speaking to different accelerators, doing some desktop research as well, and then having the conversations with the startups. I suppose from my side, it's very interesting to understand when you have the conversations with each one of those startups, how you do it in a standardized manner. So I suppose the question I would have comes back to the brief that the corporates give you. Do they give you, let's say, user stories or key sort of final outcomes that they'd like to achieve that you use to guide each one of those conversations with the startups?
We have quite a simple template that we asked our clients, the corporate clients, to fill out.
Yes.
And we always look for a brief which is slightly open, but not too open and not too specific, because the more tight it is, the less we come back with. And I think you miss opportunities on the peripheral then. But if it's wide open, then we don't want to come back with 300, because that's a really long process to go through, and maybe we won't end up where we want to end up with the client in terms of what they're looking for. So the client can give us quite a rough overview of what the problem is. In the brief template itself, there's opportunity for them to put considerations down or constraints down or the scope in a bit more detail.
Sure.
We take that, we have a discussion with the client to understand exactly what they mean, because what you read sometimes isn't necessarily how you see things, perceive things. So we want to make sure from the client that what we perceive the brief to be about is exactly right.
Yes.
And once we get that alignment with the client, we then go and start doing the search and talking to startups. When we initially talk to the startup, we don't share the brief in detail with them. The initial conversations is more around what they're doing, roughly what the brief's looking at. We don't mention the client's name, because some clients don't want it to be known that they're looking for certain tech at that time. So we keep the client's name to one side, and we just talk roughly around the brief. Our goal really is to understand what the technology is about, get a feeling for where the company's going, and most importantly, ascertain whether this could be a potential solution to the brief. And we do let the startup have an insight into the brief and what sector the client comes from.
Yes.
But we don't go into too much detail. And we also manage expectation with the startup that this is the very first stage of the process.
Yes.
And if they're lucky enough to be chosen to come and pitch, if they're one of the 5 or 6 that are chosen to pitch, then absolutely we will talk about the client, who they are, and then we'll share the whole brief with them.
Yes.
So we're quite there's a structure behind our process, but we keep it very, very open. We don't want too much. We don't want to spend loads and loads of time talking to people, but we want to give enough information to make people feel like they've got enough, should we say, information in front of them to make a decision, or to feel like they can say, yes, we're interested in this brief.
Okay, that makes sense. And I suppose, what are your key learnings of the startups and the corporates engaging together from this tried and tested process? You've been doing it for a long time.
We've done over 100 briefs now. I should count them, but it's definitely over 100. The biggest challenge we have, apart from matching startups, scale-ups with the brief, that's the big challenge. But outside of that is really managing expectations. So depending on the client,
yes,
large companies, I believe, have different expectations of the startup world. Some will see startups as acne-ridden teenagers coding in bedrooms still. They're completely oblivious to reality, which is a lot of really great companies, startups, scale-ups are out there.
Yes.
Very professional, with people of all backgrounds, all races, from different experience journeys, etc.
Yes.
It isn't just one person coding in a bedroom with an amazing idea, but nothing's come from it yet. So sometimes we have to educate the corporate that the startup world is a huge opportunity.
Yes.
And even though it's risky, everything's risky, it isn't as should we say early stages they think. We generally go for startups that have already got a product that's working, have got a couple of case studies under their belt. So they're ready to work with a corporate. Unless a corporate says we want to work with someone who's building something from scratch, we generally go with startups that have got some experience of working with corporates already. So that de-risks it. So the challenge with the corporate is managing their expectations, one of what a startup actually can do for them, because it's a $1 trillion R&D opportunity out there, in terms of what people are building. So one is managing their expectation of what a startup is and what they can do. And the other one with the corporate side is managing their expectation about what they're going to get back. If they expect the next TikTok or Snapchat overnight, which is going to triple their bottom line, then that isn't going to be the case. That's not going to happen.
Yes.
If that was out there, everyone would know about it.
Yes.
So we manage their expectations in many different ways. If we flip it to the startup side, we also have to manage expectations. So some startups will be contacted by us, and when we name the client, if they're a global corporate player,
yes,
sometimes startups will think this is it. This is the $5 million check that's going to change my life.
Yes, yeah.
And they see the brand and they see the size of the company, and they lose track of the here and the now. And if they are lucky enough to get to the pilot stage, the pilots are this side of 50K.
Yes.
They're not 6-7 digit pilots, not at this stage.
Yes.
So we have to manage our expectations there. This is a great opportunity, but this isn't going to be a game changer overnight for the startups and in a way for the corporates.
Yes.
So to summarize, expectation management is as much a challenge for us as finding the right technology options for the brief.
Yes. That's a really interesting point, because certainly from what I've seen before, sometimes, a big company will come along and speak with the startup and say, this is what we look for. The startup allocates all of their resource to doing that. But then the goalposts keep changing because different stakeholders have different requirements within the corporate, and then the startup feels like they've done all this work and it hasn't been used. Is that something?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're there to manage that as well.
Yes.
We're there to make sure that the brief at the start is very tight. Message to the client is, once the brief is established, then apart from having to attend certain meetings, they can get on with their day job. We do all the heavy lifting, all the due diligence, the interviewing, the filtering, the searching, arrange the pitch session. We do all of that so they can get on with their day job.
Yes.
What we don't want is the goalpost moving, as you say all the time. So we're very clear at the start, this is a brief, and we go with that. And once we start researching, to a certain extent, we're off.
Yes.
Now, obviously, if there is a change that needs to be implemented into the brief, fine. But that doesn't usually happen. Once we get that brief ready, it's off. But it's not good to change halfway through. And with the startup, we also, I would think, manage their expectations, but also make sure they put the right amount of effort into the work, but not so much that everything relies on it. So what we generally, to your earlier question, when we talk to a startup and we feel they're right for the brief, all we want from them is just a few lines about what they do, any links to any videos they've got that help us sell to the corporate what they do, and that's all we need. We don't want any pitch decks or any presentations at that stage.
Yes.
So we try and keep it very light touch for the startup, and until they get to the pitch stage when they have to put more work into it. So we try and keep both sides work light, if that is. We don't want everyone involved all the way through, because it can get very heavy and it can slow the process up.
Yes.
But obviously we work between the two all the time. But we're very mindful of startups' expectations, and their resource is much more strained, should we say, when they're going through the process, and maybe a large corporate's huge resources.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we dive down further into the funnel from sort of the research stage, proof of concept sort of stage, to a firm agreement being signed between the corporate and the startup, without giving away any deals, are you able to discuss or elaborate on, say, a success story?
Yeah, we've had loads. I mean, for one, our briefs are in all different areas. So we started off, a lot of it was marketing briefs. It's got more to ESG briefs. It's got more now to, we just did a brief with Scope 3 emissions measurement.
Yes.
We've looked at briefs where you can use celebrity avatars as a way of promoting a brand. We've looked at briefs to do with esports.
Wow.
And we even had a brief a couple of years ago for technology that can sit on a water pipe and tell whether there's going to be a leak a long time before the leak even starts.
Yes, yeah.
So we've
incredible.
For one, we get loads of briefs in loads of areas, and what started as a marketing domain, really, we get briefs from all departments. In terms of ones that have really worked, we worked with a client recently where they were looking to measure their Scope 3 emissions, and we helped them find a really good German company called Planetly, which help large companies look back through their supply chain and help track and measure their Scope 3 emissions. That's been a great success. We've worked with other clients more in the banking area where they were looking to bring their content to life more. It was working okay, but it wasn't great, and we paired them up with a great company called Vidsy, which do some really good consumer generated video.
Okay.
And that changed the game for the client. It wasn't only should we say content, short form video, which was 3 or 4 times more engaging than the video that they had produced before from their agencies, but also it was cheaper, faster, they got more content, and the content worked harder for them.
Fantastic.
We had one with another client where they were looking to recruit senior management, and they were a bit fed up with the Myers-Briggs model. Yeah. So we found a company out there which actually helps using gamification for senior people to play, and that identifies their kind of cognitive skills and their strengths and weaknesses, and they use that to help choose someone for the board. So we've had lots of success stories. One thing I will say is I've never quite got it right yet when I've had a brief and after going through all the searches identified the one that's going to win the pilot. Every time I think that's the one who's going to get it or maybe should get it, I'm always proved wrong. So you cannot second guess what a client at the end of the day really, really wants when they see the startups and talk to them. We have an idea, but I wouldn't put money on guessing the outcome. And that's what's part of the fun, really, because it evolves. What we think's right after talking to startups, the game can change after the pitches and the Q&As, and that's really important. So the front runner going into the pitch session may end up not being the one who gets the pilot at the end. Okay. And that's the beauty of perspective, I suppose. Yeah. It's hard to sit in the corporate shoes, as closely as you work with them. Yes. Yeah. It's. I always say to startups, the best tech or service on paper isn't always the one that gets the work. It's how you portray that technology, how you make it relevant to the client in that pitch, and also how you engage with the client when it comes to the Q&As at the end of the pitch. And I would always argue that post the initial pitch in the pitch session, the 15-20 minutes Q&As is the most important part. Because that's where the client, both sides, actually get an idea of what the other side's like, the personalities, the kind of questions, and also they get the first idea of whether they can work with the other side, whether they can see themselves from both sides working with the other party. So that Q&A bit, I would almost argue, is as important as the pitch. Okay. But that whole session, the pitch and the Q&A, can change the whole thing. You could be front runner, end up fifth. You could be fifth, end up getting the gig. Oh, fantastic. Well, I know, from my network of founders that, pitch to VCs, they really focus on the pitches and the Q&A for that, but we don't hear enough about pitches to corporates or sales pitches from startups. I hear it a lot from friends of mine who are involved in SaaS and sales, but not enough from startups engaging with corporates. I think that's the other finding we found, or the insight we found over time, is that we make sure that those pitch sessions are off-site. So apart from one of the 100 plus we've done, only one of them has been on the site of the client. The rest are off-site. One, because I think if we get the corporate clients away from their office, there's more chance that they won't be distracted by someone walking down a corridor, knocking on the door and wanting to have a chat. And also I think it's really important for our corporate clients to usually come to this session, which is in a startup venue, co-working space, whatever, and experience that that startup feel when they're there. I think that puts them in the right mindset, and I think it actually makes them realise that this is exciting. This session they're going through with us could be half a day, could be a whole day. It's completely different from the day job, completely different from the meetings they normally have, and should be embraced and should really enjoy it. And yes, there is a pressure to hopefully select a partner, or hopefully find a partner they feel comfortable to select.
Yes.
But also they should enjoy it as well, and be very open-minded. And we say to the startups that, make the most of the 45 minutes, hour you have with the client, but at the same time, don't oversell.
Yes.
Be very relaxed and think as much about the answers to the questions you get as you do to the slides you present.
Yes, fantastic. And I think a lot of what you've touched upon is almost how you're coaching the corporates and bringing them into that startup world. And I know that you've written a book about demystifying that startup world. So I'm wondering whether you could talk us through that journey of working with all of these corporates and then, writing the book, and just really dive into how you are helping those corporates, and you've helped them over the previous years.
Well, it wasn't a linear journey. I mean, when I jumped the corporate ship, the first thing that struck me was I thought I was leaving the world of jargon with the corporate world. And then when I went into the startup world, I realised that the terminology was you drown in the terminology. So within 2 or 3 months, I found myself in meetings where people were talking about burn rate, roadmap, Series A, Series B, enterprise play, convertible notes. And I thought, my goodness, what does it all mean? Now, maybe I was a little bit egotistical, a little bit confident, so I winged it a bit. I kind of nodded my head and looked it up afterwards. But as time went on, this flow of words didn't slow up.
Yes.
And so it led to be honest, about 4 years ago, I had an idea to pull a kind of what you could call a glossary of terms together.
Yes.
Of the A to Z of terms and words that I, as an ex-corporate, have had to learn to do what I'm doing now. And then it got parked. I put something like 30 words on a document, put it in the cloud somewhere and forgot it. And then just at the end of COVID, my wife said to me, whatever happened to that book idea? And I've completely forgotten about it. So I found the file, realised quite early on that I wouldn't have the time and the focus to be able to do it on my own. So I partnered with a good friend called Eamon Carey, who up until very recently was the MD at Techstars in the UK.
Yes. And
said to Eamon, look, do you fancy putting this book together between us? Because Eamon's got a phenomenal network, knowledge of the startup world, investor world. So last September, we started writing the book, September 2021. And between us, we pulled the book together. It came out in June. It's called the Startup Lexicon.
Yes.
And it's, in essence, it's 200 plus words and phrases, A to Z of terms that you need to know if you're either a corporate who's going to work with startups, if you're, dare I say, studying entrepreneurship at undergrad or postgrad at university,
yes,
if you're starting a business yourself, or if you're joining an accelerator. Anyone who is venturing into the startup world, either as a future founder or a corporate willing to engage with the startup world, then this book hopefully is for you. And we've also, rather than making it just an A to Z, which can be quite dry, we've also got insights from 25 or so experts, corporate experts, investor experts, startup founders who've been very successful, to also give some of their words and stories behind certain phrases that we've highlighted in the book. So it's what was a bit of a side hustle was really picked up. So we find out that people are wanting to talk about the book. We're Eamon and I are doing talks about the book.
Fantastic.
So it was meant to be a kind of a piece of marketing, really.
Yes.
And now has turned into a separate part of my day job,
which is
but
fantastic.
very enjoyable. And we've already, it's a very good chance we do a second edition the back end of next year, because since it came out in June, I think between us, Eamon and I have identified 30 or so, 20 or 30 words that need to go in the next edition. So,
oh, wow.
So the startup language is always evolving.
Yes.
And my passion point really is, it would be a huge shame if someone had a great business idea and maybe lacked a bit of confidence.
Yes.
And went into a meeting where someone, the people he or she is talking to, use terms they don't understand.
Yes.
And then they decided not to progress because they thought, I'm not very good. I didn't think I was. I don't understand what people are talking about, and then pull away. That's one bit that I hope the book helps. It's not going to turn you into a super entrepreneur overnight, but if it keeps you in the conversation,
yes,
and it makes you feel confident enough to engage, and maybe do more research into certain areas, then it's doing its job.
Fantastic.
So it will help corporates, but I also want it to help people who have taken that brave step of, I might start my own business.
Yes.
A little bit unsure, and maybe about themselves as well, imposter syndrome, this kind of thing. And it'd be a crying shame if people never took that next step because a few words were thrown around in the conversation which made someone feel like, oh, it's not for me.
Yeah. And I think, first of all, congratulations in terms of the fact that you're already thinking about a second edition. That's fantastic. But what I wanted to sort of refer to is the fact that although we are in a difficult period economically, often that's when a lot of innovation comes out, and so that's where the book could actually be quite relevant for people that may have never thought that they'd start their own business, but as a result of the layoffs and such, and the fact that there aren't many jobs being advertised, maybe people will actually give it a go. So it's a great time to be educating people.
You're absolutely right. I think these difficult times that people are going through now, for me personally, someone joked the other day, when I left a corporate ship 8 years ago, if you'd have said to me 2 years before I jumped that I would be working for myself, I would have said, you're mad. I never want to do that. I like the corporate world. So, and I didn't have to jump. I jumped voluntarily. I wasn't laid off, but it is a big step, but I would highly recommend it. So much so that, I don't want to shoot myself in the foot, but I would struggle now to go back into the corporate world.
Yes.
So I would recommend it, but obviously, there's difficult times at the moment, so it's not for everyone. But at the same time, I don't think it should be dismissed. I think people should think about it because there's more support out there now. There's more options out there now. Yes. And I also think that being an entrepreneur now is is deemed in a much more positive way than definitely it was 20 or 30 years ago. Yes. So it's pretty cool now in a way to be an entrepreneur. It's tough. But I think it's much more acceptable now to say, I'm going to start my own business.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, I think it's interesting when I told my parents that I was going to leave my job and start, my own business, I suppose their reactions were, oh no, like that's very risky. But actually, if you look at, a whole lot of different people, who are, let's say, they're tradespeople. They might be a plumber or they might have a construction firm. They're entrepreneurs as well. Just because they don't work with tech doesn't mean that they're not entrepreneurs. And so, I guess my view of this is, sure, I might work with a bit of tech, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's any more risky than launching a business in any other trade.
No, absolutely not. And I the funny thing is, once you do run your own business, you see more entrepreneurs out there.
Yes. Yeah.
So, funnily enough, we're having work done in the house at the moment. So our house, as of today, is full of electricians, people putting windows in, people looking at kitchens. I mean, and all of these people have got their own businesses, be it one person business or 3 or 4. But they've all got their own individual accounts, cash flow challenges, business challenges. But it's their own business. And you're exactly right. We may work in a world where a lot of the startups I work with are tech based, but they don't own the startup ecosystem. And there's plenty of people out there doing amazing businesses that don't involve technology at all, and dare I say, don't need technology. So technology isn't the only thing that determines if you're a good or a trendy entrepreneur. I'm really, should we say, I'm behind everyone who's running their own business, whatever it may be in.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Ken, we did touch upon the difficult economic times just previously. You've been in the industry for a fair while now. What tips or sort of key takeaways would you give to founders or operators, regardless of whether, let's say, they're in a corporate, they're in a startup, they own their own business? Let's say, what would your top 3 takeaways be for the audience?
I think one takeaway for maybe on the startup side is to remain focused on what matters. And if we're going into difficult times now, I think it's really focusing on where the business is and where you can get the most return for the work you're going to put in. I think when times are good, you can start trying different things and everything. But once it gets a little bit tough, I always say just keep focused on what will help grow the business and bring, in some cases, bring the cash flow into the business to keep it going. So focus on the key areas.
Yes.
And really, really hone your time and focus and bandwidth into the areas that will make a difference.
Sure.
So I would say one is definitely focus. I think maybe more for the corporate side is don't, if budgets are getting cut, we hear a lot of clients saying that times are changing, that the future is quite uncertain, costs, as we know, are going up. One tip I would say is keep the innovation flame burning, especially if you've got momentum.
Yes.
So it's very easy to say, look, times are tough, and I fully understand where it comes from. We're stop the innovation for now. We're stop the getting outside people in to help us. Let's just focus on keeping the business going, which kind of relates to what I've just said. But for corporate, I think if they can, try and keep that innovation flame going. Keep the curiosity going. So what we've found with a lot of our clients now is some are carrying on as they are, still saying let's just carry on with the briefs and work with pilots and startups and pilots. Others are saying, can we just cut back a little bit and do just the research side of it? Which is really good, actually. They don't want to commit to work with a startup if at some point it's not going to happen. They don't want to let people down. That's very admirable.
Indeed.
So some are saying, right, we want to keep going, but for the next 2 or 3 briefs, let's go halfway through the process and get the lie of the land, work out what's out there, and then when we're a bit more certain, we'll finish off the second half and we start getting the pitches and working with someone. But they've got all the information there ready to go when the time presents itself again.
Okay.
And we find that with new clients. We've had quite a lot of new clients come to us recently, bizarrely, in situations where the market now is quite tough, and saying, look, we understand what you do.
Yes.
We'd love to work with you and go right to the pilot stage, but because of the current situation, we can't. But let's start working together, and can you just give us some insight first and some research first? So they're actually coming to us as new clients saying, right, we've got to carry on as business as usual, but on the side, we want to set 2 or 3 kind of curiosity streams off where we've got 3 or 4 pieces of research running under you. So when the time is right, we can use those findings to help us get more budget to start working with startups. So it's just keeping that innovation curiosity going. Yes, I would argue, and if we can help clients identify opportunities, it doesn't mean they have to jump on it straight away, but at least it's there. So when the opportunity comes up with budget, they can say, well, we've got the case study here to go ahead, which we're working with this company in this area. So if there was 2 insights, I'd say if you're a startup, generally just focus on what's important, because that's crucial. And I think if you're a corporate, generally, I would say, if possible, don't put out the innovation flame. Keep it going. Maybe turn it down a little bit. Maybe just keep the research going. And by all means, if you want to work with a startup, fantastic. But it doesn't have to be you have to work with startups or you don't. You can go halfway and still go out there and see what's out there. Help us identify opportunities for you. So when the time comes, you can leverage those opportunities.
Fantastic. Ken, we've covered a lot today. Any closing remarks?
No, I think it's been fantastic, and I think sitting here talking about the startup world, all that does is just reinforces why it's great. It's a great environment to be in. Yes, it is challenging. But as to my previous point, I mean, it's a great place to be. It's always changing, and just reminds me of the reason really why I jumped the ship in the first place and wanted to work more in the startup ecosystem.
Excellent.
But thank you for the opportunity.
No. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your experience and your views, for talking about the book. It'll be great, maybe in a few months' time we can do a round 2, a podcast dedicated to the second edition of the book.
Watch this space.
Yeah, indeed. But look, thanks so much for really digging into how different corporates collaborate with startups, and how you and Progressive, the team at Progressive, act as that glue in the middle. Some really interesting insights, and again, very grateful that you're able to join us today. Thank you, Ken.
My pleasure.